Hello everyone, today we talk about the Seleucid phalangite for our historical military unit series. You can say Seleucid, this is not much of an issue. I have this very interesting university memories in which same sort of Grecists told us that how you can, in that case, a Byzantinist and a philologist and historian of literature tell us, with all those accents in the Greek names, you can fundamentally choose, however, to report them into your language. In any case, this is an important video for a number of reasons. First of all, this is not the first video about the Macedonian phalanx, the Macedonian style phalanx. I made something else for different series, also specials, etc. It is actually the very first video, in fact, about a phalangite unit, per se. It is actually the first video about Seleucid warfare after a very long time. We will see, if anything, at the end of the video, which videos I already made on the Seleucid army. This allows us to make a brief consideration. In the last year or so, I started making, if anything, more specials, right? Interspersed, 50-50 normally. Or perhaps a bit more than 50, but still fundamentally balanced in half between the lottery extracted topics like this one today, for example, and further specials. So last year I ran a poll on Schwerpunkt, and it turned out that most of you are interested in medieval history, which the results, however, told me that basically Schwerpunkt attracts a pretty evenly balanced amount of history lovers on the basis of the same exact era's segmentation, as far as my attention to that is concerned. How many videos I've already made on that. So it was practically a useless pool. YouTube pushes you a bit more to remain consistent within a specifically narrow topic. There are some sort of algorithmic penalties if you come out of what at least the majority of your viewers consider to be sort of a relevant topic or not. So I'm not going to digress on this kind of analytic aspects, regardless in fact of the individual success per interest that a single video can have in general on YouTube, aside from a channel. So complicated story. But meaning that, especially since last year, the lottery extraction, which was the only one in which I normally discussed about Hellenistic warfare, was halved. Recently, as you know, I started a series about Alexander in Afghanistan, which is a completely sort of special divertissement. It doesn't have any broader structural attachment, if not by topic, with many other things that we also have to do about Alexander, and not only. Anyway, so probably at some point we'll introduce a bit more basic Hellenic and Hellenistic history, not just military historical one, but the point being that if you're really interested in Hellenistic warfare, that I've seen channels like Kings and Generals have really pioneered a lot compared to other topics that were very underrepresented among the various things. But just tell me, right? It can be an interesting advice for me to understand how many of you are actually interested in this stuff. That, as it happens, in fact, also for other topics, is actually a topic that I know much more about compared even to my medieval specialization, my professional specialization, and this is somehow surprising, right? Aerial warfare, I'm very much into that. And I really practically discussed this, barely ever discussed it in Schwerpunkt. Hellenistic warfare, I'm much more into it than anything that the proportions on Schwerpunkt would make you think. Don't ask me why. This is sort of, that's how it's come out. Schwerpunkt is still an experiment as far as all this melange is concerned. However, as today we're going to see, there is definitely a lot to cover, even just about this specific military historical unit that, as you know, in this sub-series I mostly describe as far as arms and armor is concerned, but also to give a general idea about who these soldiers were and fundamentally how we think they fought, which is something different from what they did, right? Obviously enough in a reconstructed context, but we know very few about the Hellenistic phalanx, right? We know far more for different historiographical reasons about classical Hellenic phalanxes than about the later Macedonian, say Hellenistic Macedonian style ones. It has to do also with the extraction of these troops. It has to do with the institutional forms of essentially feudal kingdoms under the heirs of Alexander. So in any case, let's conceptualize a bit the Seleucid phalangite, because of course among the Diadochoi and the Seleucids there are differences among all the various realms that emerge from the partition of Alexander's empire, but the Seleucid one is definitely the empire that, at least in a broader geographical sense, and by scale also, in part, in a political and strategical sense, was the closest to Alexander's legacy. Obviously, the antagonists of Macedon and sort of the Macedonian military tradition in the Balkans, in Hellas, fundamentally was sort of ideally, identitarily, ethnically, and more the most continuative one. I also made a video about the Antigonid army. However, the Seleucid Empire, Seleucia, as a matter of fact, all these polities had actually different names. All right. For example, the Ptolemies were Basileia, right? Technically also Macedon, but they call it simply Macedonia, as a matter of fact. So it's really interesting to see the difference in semantics, in sheer meaning and etymology. Arche stands for just like, the top, right? But understood in a truly imperial sense. We also drew parallelisms in unexpected videos, at least for as far as popular awareness is concerned, regarding, for example, some Hellenistic divine power ideology and the one still used by crusaders, right? A bit in part also because they literally came to fight in some, of course, the places controlled by these empires. If anything, as you know, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids in particular, fought many wars just wrestling to control places like Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and so on. Phoenicia, Palestine, and so on. Right? There's really a lot to it. These the Diadochoi's armies were actually quite different from one another. I mean, the basis at the beginning was fundamentally the same, and it's not like, as also we will partially learn today, with the Seleucid phalanges in particular, in terms of the core, right, the fundamentals. Of course, the Diadochoi armies at large not even entirely used the Macedonian-style phalanx. For example, the Attalids literally didn't have enough resources to afford a phalanx. It literally requires a massively structured regional, multi-regional territorial control with specific military colonies and a traumatically astronomical amount of wealth in order to field a body, a large enough body of pikemen to be properly drilled and equipped to function as a phalanx was something extremely expensive. It's something utterly unbelievable. The same size construction, just for conferring them that level of elasticity and resistance required, also due to their to their increasing length, was something utterly insane, right? These were, of course, like the by far most advanced military machine of the time. Yet, as I was saying before, we do not know too much about how they actually fought, right? And this is notorious to anybody who has even a cursory knowledge of the historiographical availability, right? It's funny, of course, as in the age of the internet, you will find a person that sorted out how the Macedonian phalanx actually worked, right? Because he had a videotape of that. And the truth is that notoriously the sources stop to a point, right? And there is no Kabbalistic alchemy which you can recompose the sources because you're a genius and you know how this thing actually worked, right? We have an idea of how it worked. Of course, there is some basis on which to look at it, but at the same time, it's sort of very complicated to reconstruct this. And in the Seleucid case, there is a paradox because you have the strongest power that actually maintained a phalanx, right? To a very large degree. The most infantry, the most phalanx-based force remain actually Macedon. interestingly enough. The Antagonids had sort of more of an infantry-based force to begin with. The Seleucids were the more combined arm tactics kind of oriented guys, also because they had much greater resources, a much bigger level of control, largely overlapping, in fact, with Alexander, the expanse of Alexander's and the former Achaemenid Empire. As we will see, in fact, the characteristic, if you see a guy here with trousers and chainmail, so just know that this is exactly the stereotype that we're looking at today. The fact that these Seleucid phalangites, for different reasons, were influenced by so many different types of military cultures that toward the later period, also the peak of it, think about Magnesia, also under Antiochus the Great, so the Anabasis in the east, to recover the lost satrapies, etc., is by far the actual monster, right? It's actually what Rome barely manages to crush. In fact, as it happened in Magnesia, where things were quite dangerous for the Romans themselves, however, succeeded in Athenium. There's a bit of sort of Oriental bias. Something if you, I made a very little, the 2 hours long video that summarizes the battle. Right, I made a video that is from one of my master degree thesis that I made for an exam of Roman history, in which I literally studied all the 7 battles in which we know that the Romans fought the Macedonian family. Macedonian. When I say Macedonian here, I use it as the same Seleucids used it. Macedonian here means like the ethnic Hellenic, or at least what were considered communitarily as military colonies, force that phalanxes were normally extracted from. I made actually an entire video already about the Seleucid army, where you see that the Seleucids had opened also to different other elements, right? That at some point, the same Alexander actually, before dying, as had started recruiting a phalanx made of Persians, of Arabs, and so on. And I'm not here going to simply, if anything, we'll talk about it down the line in the video, but so the core made Macedonian. Of course, there were different elements, but overall, we're talking also the same type of fighting training. These guys were condensed in, because these colonies were literally, like, again, surviving across time and distinguishing themselves for that specific peculiarity of combat training and so on. There were other countries where this thing collapsed. For example, the Ptolemies at some point do not use the phalanx anymore because it's too costly. They were chronically in debt. Egypt was a total mess. The Seleucids are the power that fundamentally recovers more and better, is bigger, more powerful. And as I was saying before, it receives these influences from the Celts, from the Romans as far as chainmail is concerned. You have trousers in the Iranian style. This is actually the least important thing of all, right? People are thrilled by this kind of, this guy copied because there is no, right? More or less soldiers across the Mediterranean and beyond were pretty much the same thing. And so arms and armor are actually the more superficial aspect that you have to look at. If you want to know how armies fought, you have to consider them as military machines as a whole. But these influences are also telling of course, which kind of people these were, again, from where they came from, how did they participate into this immense, truly ecumenic empire that the Seleucid one was. That, however, is also very much pertaining to this broader East, and therefore is much worse documented by some degree than Macedon. One could say even of Egypt in theory, it's probably better documented, but because the Romans go more directly at war against them. At some point, they had invaded Greece. As you know, there is the Battle of the Thermopylae, then there is Magnesia. And so all famous engagements between the Romans and the Seleucids. We're not going, if anything, to talk much about this, but I presume that you're fully acquainted with the whole story. Let's give it even some deeper historical background. The Seleucid phalangite formed the core of the heavy infantry in the armies of the Eastern Hellenistic kingdoms. Right? It wasn't much of a difference. Right? We just explained this. It drew upon Macedonian traditions adapted to the different territories under Seleucid control, which at their height stretched from the Mediterranean coast through Syria, Mesopotamia, and Iran as far as the borders of India, under the successive rule of the dynasty founded by Seleucus I Nicator. Naturally, this empire at some point starts shrinking. The eastern satrapies are actually the ones that tend to take off on their own. Think about Bactria, that had historically had quite a different character on its own. We've just seen it, in fact, in the series about Alexander in Afghanistan. There was even a more strictly sort of Hellenic, Southern Hellenic, sometimes even Cretan specifically, colonial legacy from pre-Alexandrian times of the Achaemenid rule in these regions that favored eventual sort of de facto independence, and the fact that a Bactrian ruler breaking off with the Seleucid rule. As I was saying before, we never really entered the evenemental history of the Diadochoi, but you know that Seleucus I Nicator, originally a senior officer, a companion cavalry to begin with of Alexander, rose from satrap to king through calculated alliances and battlefield successes. Right, satrapies were at large maintained across the empire, but it wasn't even necessarily this. We tend always to say there was this great continuity with Achaemenid administrative system. As a matter of fact, things actually broke down. Right, the Macedonian conquest was not nor a walk in the park, nor also particularly a lightly felt event across the empire. So, as we will see now, this will contribute to alter the social cultural landscape of these lands, as far as also military organization is concerned. After the partition of Alexander's empire, 323 BC, Seleucus secured Babylonia in 312. That is, in fact, the conventional foundation date of the Seleucid era. Having received the satrapy of Babylonia in the second partition at Triparadeisos in 320, and reconquered it after temporary expulsion by Antigonus Monophthalmus. His victory at Ipsus in 301, achieved in coalition with Lysimachus. I made a video about the guy, his army. As a matter of fact, if you're interested in this essentially Thracian power of the Diadochoi, you can look at that. And Cassander against, I'm not meaning for, since you know that Schwerpunkt is systematically subject to attempted misunderstanding, like, of course, not like it wasn't like a Thracian power, of course it was a Macedonian power, Thrace. And Cassander against Antigonus and Demetrius secured Syria and much of Asia Minor and enabled the foundation of Antioch on the Orontes as the new royal capital. All right, it's like saying, again, indeed, the Seleucid Empire was a Syro-Macedonian power at large, right? Also, Mesopotamia was admittedly the other true core land of the empire. That's also why it was so powerful in many ways. The rest were some sort of more sort of detached, decentralized, so to say, secondary provinces, right? We'll partially see how recruitment worked all across the board here. The other thing, this video is not about the Seleucid army organization. I made something about Seleucid cavalry, I think, several years ago. A very old video. We could also remake it for that matter. But we'll come back on all of this. We made so few about the Seleucid army that even if we already covered something many years ago, we're always going to sort of re-enter the topic here and there, like including today. But this is just for saying that we're not looking at the entirety, say, of the phalangites recruitment organizational system. That's mostly something that will pertain to another video. But from here, we will also understand, however, partially that, considering who these men were, where they came from, right, how they were recruited, and what were their service conditions, so to say. Now, the Seleucid realm at its peak encompassed roughly the eastern half of Alexander's conquests. All right, we said it before, it was the most directly continuous with the bulk of Alexander Empire as de facto the territorial extension, right? But it was also the strongest for those reasons, also largely overlapped with what had been the Achaemenid Empire, as a matter of fact. Troops of the type we use here, say our poster guy, which is always, like, again, a stereotypical one, appear in terracotta plaques recovered from Campania in southern Italy, a region that experienced extensive Hellenistic cultural and military contacts through trade and mercenary service, particularly after the arrival of Epirus in 280, as far as we're talking properly about Hellenistic warfare, because, of course, there was an important Hellenic legacy, as we'll look at now. But it's important because this was essentially a Samnitic territory that, however, had really very substantial interest, evidently enough, in also Hellenistic affairs. Of course, there were still Hellenic polis on the coast, also in Roman times, and this is mostly where this Hellenic and Hellenic-minded world tended to produce, also in the more advanced polis of the hinterland, to produce also the peak of the Roman Empire that sort of absorbed this also from the Romano-Italic background of sort of general Hellenistic influence at that point. The awareness, the interest, the curiosity, the knowledge of Hellenistic soldiers, the exploit of the great sovereigns of the East. Campania, centered on the fertile plain around Capua and Neapolis, had long maintained commercial links with the Eastern Mediterranean through Hellenic colonies such as Cumae. Campania is also the single most overtly traumatically developed in the Roman Empire. Campania Felix, together with Latium itself. In fact, if you look really at the core of Roman Italy, the disproportionately advanced, developed, populated, and affluent parts of the peninsula are Latium and Campania. That's what would also make them become the receptacle of these Hellenistic influences in a way. The plaques depict soldiers combining Macedonian and Asiatic elements of dress and equipment, a mixture consistent with forces operating in the East under the successors of Alexander. All right. The presence of these motives reflects both the employment of companion mercenaries in Eastern armies, which was actually a thing. We've seen how in the Ptolemaic army made a video about its organization. We hear of Italic, among the various nationalities, there were Thracians, etc., Italic military colonists that were part of the actual phalanx, as long as the Ptolemies could afford that, as a matter of fact. And I made multiple videos explaining, again, how far the reach of the Italics historically had been as mercenaries and beyond. You have this diffusion of artistic styles following Pyrrhus's Italian campaign in 280-275, Heraclea, Asculum, in the inconclusive Battle of Beneventum. Now, this is just, I couldn't use the picture because there is not an available one as far as commercial availability, right, and copyright availability for a YouTube channel is concerned. So I just modeled the soldiers a bit overall on these, on the basis of such hints, right. Through AI, I sort of spent a substantial amount of time certifying that the historical detail is as correct as the medium allows, which means that if this didn't look like these troops would have actually looked like with some sort of major flaw or with complete anachronistic and thematically pertinent features, I will not use them. I've never done so. I've never say an Hellenic horseman with a stirrup. Like I will not use it, so to say. Right. There are debates regarding the development of stirrup. Actually, this is not the most extreme situation. I made multiple videos explaining the development of the stirrup, from where and how. This is not the point to digress on, but this is exactly the point that I'm making. I'm not just hyperfixating on the detail per se, but also in representing what is historically plausible, right, at a rate that allows me to fill the gaps as far as the legal use of imagery is concerned, right? And AI is holding, in this sense, great part of this problem, right? So when we look at these hints, like the Asiatic influences we'll look at now, similar characteristics would have applied, for example, to the Persian phalangites enrolled by Alexander himself during the final years of his Asian campaigns, right? When he systematically incorporated native troops into Macedonian formations. You know that he was essentially to conquer Arabia and then Carthage with those. So you can imagine, of course, in antiquity, the level of military uniformity being somehow difficult. Much of what really made a soldier was arms and armor, right? Hence also the cingulum militaris from Rome that flows into medieval knighthood as an indicator of a freeman and a nobleman at the same time, which was the actual classical meaning, right? In a metaphysical sense, even for the proletarian legionnaire as a higher race, right, of world conquerors over other peoples. And so that's a thing. But dress was another thing, right? And it was a great deal, especially you can imagine also the lack of resources and the possibility of literally uniforming an army, right? First of all, at the time, it didn't make much sense, even in terms of psychological, tactical expandability, but we've seen it also for the Roman army. Rome spent an enormity for her military. She wouldn't care about, say, uniforming troops only with single color, right? Single cohorts would take care of that on their own, right? It would end up being standardizing color largely through their own means and other practical necessities. In any case, this was not even important. The point I was making is that, of course, you would have this great deal of exotic clothing among, say, the literal Persian phalanges of the last Alexander, right? This mechanism began in earnest after the Battle of Gaugamela in 331, the crushing, definitive, at least as far as strictly Achaemenid power, dynastically speaking, is concerned, clash near the village of that name east of the Tigris in late September or early October that shattered the Achaemenid field army under Darius III by a combination of a deliberate gap in the Macedonian line, drawing the Persian center forward, and a crushing companion cavalry charge, and intensified during the Indian expedition of 327-325 BC, where when Alexander trained 30,000 Oriental youths as epigonoi. Epigonoi comes from the Hellenic word meaning successors or descendants, right? So from epi meaning after in this case, and gonos meaning birth or offspring, literally translates to those born after or the younger generation. Right. For example, in Hellenic mythology, the Epigonoi were the sons of the legendary seven against Thebes that successfully attacked the city a generation after their fathers died trying. In historical context, most famously used by ancient writers like Arrian to describe Alexander the Great's experiment, it refers to the young native Asian youths whom Alexander selected, drafted, and trained in Macedonian military tactics, language, and weaponry. Right. And so by calling them epigonoi, ancient sources highlighted them as a new generation of soldiers meant to bridge the gap between the Macedonian conquerors and the peoples of the Persian Empire as well. This, remember, is under Alexander. And the subsequent enrollment of Persian youths formed as part of, in fact, of Alexander's broader policy of fusion, which also included the mass wedding at Susa in 324. This Asian pantodapoi of the early successors and later contingents of Mithridates VI of Pontus, who ruled the kingdom of Pontus on the southern Black Sea coast from 120 to 63 BC, building a multicultural realm that challenged Roman expansion in Anatolia and the Aegean and modeled parts of his army on Hellenistic precedents, drawing on both Seleucid exiles and local Anatolian traditions after successive wars against Rome, share comparable features. A couple of things about these considerations. First of all, the word pantodapoi is the masculine plural nominative form of pantodapos, meaning of all sorts, of every kind, or from all quarters, everywhere. So the idea and the difference between the pezhetairos, so the footmen of the phalanx, the ones that we're looking at here, without further distinction, because as we'll see now, there's many, refers to auxiliary forces, like these ones that Alexander would have used as he was enlisting them, which also suggests by definition what we were saying before, that the Achaemenid Empire had actually been shattered. This is really normal in the history of civilization. There is a conquest. Normally the social-cultural fabric of the country is heavily shattered, right, is lacerated, and there are so many different young men that really have nothing to lose, and they are going to act as cannon fodder, so to say, being enlisted by and sort of freely presenting themselves as recruits for these military experiments, right? And in part to reacquire some sort of status. But as we'll see partially in this video, again, we will talk about this. The Macedonians, so properly the phalanx, because this was yet, as we will see now, yet the other name of which the pezhetairos were termed, literally to say these were the Macedons, were in fact recruited only from Macedonian colonies, right? So while I made a video explaining that these colonies definitely subsume some other ethnic element, this was fundamentally transfigured as the world master race into these military colonies that were incredibly well organized, hierarchical. We'll see now how partially the recruitment worked. They were essentially exempted from certain taxation in exchange for their military service that they would, in any case, be able to provide exactly because they were flourishing, were thriving as the Macedonian settlers across this immense empire, right? So this is an important difference as far as the Seleucids are concerned with Alexander's policies, that they actually stuck to the ethnic Macedonian recruitment, right? And naturally, there are different contextual reasons why this would happen, also why Alexander was seeking other local ethnic forces for enrollment. The other aspect here we touched upon is Mithridates, a king of Pontus, that, as you know, was one of the greatest enemies of Rome between the 2nd and the 1st century BC. And even though at the Battle of Chaeronea, where the Pontics are defeated by Sulla, right, during their invasion of Hellas, a bit the same that Antiochus III had done with eventually with the Thermopylae, etc. And one source in particular uses the terms phalanx for the Pontics. We're not sure, actually. I'm very sure of the opposite. As a matter of fact, that the Pontics had developed anything like a Macedonian phalanx, because they did not have the means to do so, right? The Attalids had not had it. The Pontics had some sort of quickly and unstably acquired Hellenistic kingdom, some sort of mix between a sort of pirate state, Persian and Hellenistic influence. And so this territory was so disarticulated that the notion that they would have the capacity of training a functional Macedonian-style phalanx, that also we don't really hear anymore after the Diadochoi, and this would be allegedly not even the specific distinguisher, but people wanted to read in the term and the fact that this could be one, and this is apparently not the case at all. There had been some rebellion also carried by some Thracians in Macedon, had attempted to reveal, in fact, something more, but not even there, the experiment had been complete. So the continuity that we're hinting at here is rather the one with the Seleucid Empire. It had been drastically resized at that point. It still existed, actually, in Syria. As we will see now, with a specific reduction of the pike element as well, but still with military colonists that had belonged once upon a time, and also considering the Roman conquest of Anatolia multiple generations before, to a Seleucid military system of sort. And so we're looking at the various elements of the same Anatolian hinterland. There was plenty of what were normally called Turielphoroi, which were essentially the typical rank-and-file trooper that you found across the entirety of Europe and Mediterranean, being a guy with an oval shield, a couple of spears/javelins, and some metal armor if it was more affluent, right? And that this region was plenty of, right? So again, we'll talk more and better about the Pontic army. I think never really made a video about Pontus, if not the Roman conquered Pontus, the Roman province of Pontus. We're gradually, as I said at the beginning, expanding toward that direction, but be careful about the terminology, the implications of any information and definition, because they do matter, right? And there is always quite some sound historiographical attention. As we were saying before, like if you think that we know everything about how the system worked, it means that you don't know how historiography has already exhausted practically everything that we could know, like save some new archaeological find that will not really alter the broader picture that is primarily and obviously historiographically based. There is really not this mystery and sort of capacity to sort out new solutions of how ancient warfare worked. Now, the trousers here mark clear barbarian influence, and at least one plate of the aforementioned Campanian ones shows the addition of long sleeves as well, which, as far as the Middle Eastern weather, some regions of Iran in winter are pretty darn cold, right? So this is completely normal. It's also what the Romans fundamentally do as they conquer places like Gaul, etc. Even dress fashions that had always been there, right? There had always been ways and means to adapt to local climate and wear this or that item. There was a sense of virility among the Hellenes, the Romans from the Mediterranean world, in sort of having naked legs, right? Going out there, also in pretty, again, Hellas or Italy, they're not particularly hot country. I mean, the interlands can be quite cold, but we find this, in fact, also among other sort of primitive barbarian populations as well, especially in the moment of combat where things get truly heated up. Now, in this evidence that we have, the cuirass shown flexes with the wearer's movement and is therefore linen or leather rather than rigid plate. So here we're talking about linothorax, and linothorax sometimes could be actually metal or with pieces of metal. In fact, it was some sort of brigandine, right? The standard linothorax was not a brigandine type. However, they share conceptual similarity in how they use layered composite materials to stop weapons, right? The linothorax was thus primarily an organic armor made entirely of textile, consisted of multiple layers of heavy linen canvas, typically 10 to 20 layers. Modern experimental archaeology shows they were usually laminated together using a natural animal or plant-based glue, acting similarly to an ancient fiber-reinforced composite or modern Kevlar, right? The brigandine in the Middle Ages instead is, as you know, in the later Middle Ages, is fundamentally a metal-plated armor. It consists of many small overlapping steel plates riveted directly to the inside of cloth or leather outer garments such as canvas, velvet, or wool. Now, where the confusion comes in sometimes, there are overlaps, ancient historic depictions like the Alexander mosaic that I made a video about, yet other Campanian source, as a matter of fact, and some historical descriptions suggest that wealthy commanders sometimes reinforce their linen cuirasses with rows of small bronze scales, iron splints, or metal shoulder guards. When metal plates are sandwiched inside or riveted to a cloth garment in this manner, it functionally operates in this exact same mechanical principle as a medieval brigandine, right? So both armors would rely on a flexible outer fabric layer backing a stiff energy dispersing core designed to catch and absorb the kinetic energy of a blow rather than just deflecting it off a solid sheet of metal, right? Now, the point here is that we're not sure how many troops would and could receive this extra level of metal protection, right? I think that probably in the anterior ranks you would obviously find this because the general heaviness of combat, right? People think, as we'll see now, there are people like Secunda, for example, that say, well, by the East there was much more archery, etc., composite bows. Being in the front ranks was a tougher experience. Yes, but there is no comparison with the sort of hand-to-hand combat traumas that these Macedons, with their phalanxes, actually inflicted also to one another among the many wars against one another, also in the East, right, east of the Tigris. There's this idea that the phalanx was just basically some guys stopping there in this formation, poking at each other, and most of the thing done by the wings without much bloodshed in the front. This is completely insane, right? We know pretty well from certain battles that even as many as 1/10 of people were lost in the hand-to-hand combat before the rout, which is actually a pretty darn high level of attrition for troops that, especially like the phalangites, are conceived mostly as, they were just some static guys that, placed everything on the formation without any kind of hand-to-hand. This is the typical sort of post-Vietnam War syndrome that created mental disturbations, such as first the politic heresy and then the even more mentally ill debunking of the same. They're the two faces of the same metal of essentially like being completely alienated from what kind of warfare actually was and what kind of things are actually supposed to be studied in order to understand how formations worked. The point, as we were saying before a bit as for the Romans, is that we don't have actually evidence of, in this case in particular, of a general transition among the infantry of the Hellenistic kingdoms to metal body armor, right? In some cases, as we'll see today, they actually did, right? And since the beginning, they actually already had armored phalangites, metal armored phalangites. But this would mostly just be a thing for guard units, whatever. So, and even for the wall numbers of the phalangites, maybe just the anterior ranks were that cuirassed, so to say, and it was useless essentially to armor that level. So the posterior ranks that had throughout all history. This is true also among the other armies, right? Any army at the time, the front ranks were more heavily armored in general. And there are so many technical reasons why, because the file openers are truly also the ones that lead the fight. In many ways, the others can't be so experienced as them. So it's, and it's all, again, all the threat comes from the front in many ways within a single unit. Then you can find the Romans who had at some point the triarii, the most heavily armored gradually in the posterior positions, etc. But the single units were always like that. This had already been the case in classical Hellenic warfare and so on. And this is what we will be discussing today, because as we were saying here, we used a bit for example, the chainmail, for example, in the pictures to show this kind of external influence deriving from the Celts, the Italics, and the Iranian trousers, right, for these Syro or Babylonian Macedonian recruits. Asclepiodotus, the Hellenic tactical writer of the 1st century BC, whose surviving Tactica summarizes the organization and equipment of the Hellenistic phalanx, drawing upon earlier manuals, possibly including those of Poseidonius, and systematically describing the phalanx's organization in 2 files, companies and larger units, in a tradition that also underlies the longer treatise of Aelian, refers to corselets, and Plutarch does likewise when describing the Achaeans of Philopoemen. That was, as you know, the Achaean statesmen in general of the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BC, who reformed the league's infantry along Macedonian lines after observing the effectiveness of the Macedonian system during his service under Antigonus Doson at Sellasia in 222 BC. These are very important, famous battles and steps, also for our possibility of properly appreciating how the non-Macedonian Hellenic armies were developing, if anything, along the Macedonian pattern. For example, the Spartans Athens does not seem to have done much about that, but Sparta, defying all what we said before in terms of needing to have a major regional territory in order to even field the phalanx, that the Attalids themselves as the Adoco didn't actually have the possibility of doing so with a much larger army, actually converted and made a very early video on Schwerpunkt on this topic. Nearly the entirety of their infantry forces as Macedonian-style phalangites, right? Which is particularly impressive, just considering the limited resources of Sparta, but also, and possibly even more, because of the cultural prejudice of the Spartans allegedly being some reactionaries incapable of change that sort of every kid believes just because they have to act as if they know anything about this. In any case, Sellasia, when we look at it, these events were sort of preoccupying all these various powers. It was this hard-fought engagement in the northern Peloponnese that secured, in fact, Antigonic dominance over the same Sparta by defeating Cleomenes III, and that's also what actually triggers that change further, right? Toward the end of their time, Spartans had almost accomplished that reform, if you want. Now, neither of these sources specify metal construction, right? The wording suits leather equally well. The term thoraces, for example, suits any kind of engagement. It's not a material indicator, it's an anatomic indicator. It means a torso armor, right? And there were all kinds. As we'll see now, we do not know too much about padded armor. We see the linen one. This is something slightly different. There is much debate regarding this because, of course, the organic material is much more difficultly recoverable from antiquity and also less depicted compared to the level of medieval iconography. But we do know that leather and iron, bronze, etc. was used practically for every kind of design. We even found fragments of the so-called lorica segmentata in bronze, right? Which is very recent, some years ago now, find, but it's, it's completely unsurprising, right? If you have any idea of how varied actually arms and armor really were and how widespread all the various different types were across the whole board, right? For example, the Roman manica is something that here you find also in the people said, oh, well, this is something that emerges from gladiatory. The same Oriental style Macedonian cataphracts had that. Like we have it on the altar of Pergamon. It's something that really was there, and even if you don't have this evidence here and there specifically for that timeline, so you can be sure that, of course, some Roman triados would have been using a manichae without much of a surprise throughout, the 3rd century BC. Philopoemen, later as strategos of the Achaean League around 208-207, replaced the traditional Achaean equipment with the Macedonian sarissa and heavier armor. As a matter of fact, because the Achaean League was, in fact, a group of city-states, so they had enough resources to carry out some kind of Macedonian-style reform of their heavy infantry. Illustrations of infantry non-metallic corselets, by the way, are common, while plate cuirasses usually appear with the waist sashes of officers, mostly in gold and in red. They were the colors of the divine race, divine blood, sacred royalty in particular. Reliefs of warriors near Ephesus, the major Ionian city on the western coast of Asia Minor that served as an important Seleucid administrative and naval center controlling the Kaiser Valley and serving as a key mint and harbor for the dynasty's Aegean fleets, already a major commercial and religious center under the Achaemenids with its famous temple of Artemis, right, show comparable corselets with short sleeves and bare legs, interestingly enough. These are possibly connected with the tomb of Antiochus II Theos, who died there in 246 BC after a reign of 15 years, marked by the Second Syrian War against Ptolemy II and the temporary recovery of territories in Asia Minor following the death of his father Antiochus I Soter, the son of Seleucus, who consolidated the core Syrian and Anatolian holdings while contending with Galatian incursions. Right, as we were saying before, Asia Minor was pretty big. Also, region was somehow more decentralized across the Taurus Mountains, and so there was intermittent control from the side of the Seleucids. It mostly tended to arrive up to places like, in fact, Ephesus, like in the brutally overly advanced western part of an otherwise pretty relatively primitive hinterland. Consider that there is capacity to reach even as Europe at some point from the Seleucid side. The Ptolemies controlled Lysimacheia, for example, at some point. That was the city of Lysimachos in Thrace, just for telling you how during the Syrian wars, for example, there were all these kind of machinations, also with the rest of, for example, of the Hellenistic powers in the West. Now, Antiochus II Theos, whose epithet obviously reflects contemporary claims of divine favor, or divinity for that matter, concluded the Second Syrian War with a peace that restored several coastal cities to Seleucid control before his death at Ephesus, possibly by poisoning. Most of these figures wear crested Attic helmets, in contrast to the uncrested Thracian type attested on coins of the usurper Tryphon, originally named Diodotus, who seized power in 142 BC, we're pretty late in time, by acting as regent for the child Antiochus VI Dionysus, before declaring himself king after a career that began as a general under Alexander Ballas and involved control of Antioch and much of northern Syria. As we'll see later, much deteriorated times at this point. Again, it's basically just Syria that you can't call something like Seleucid. It's Pompey that eventually terminates that, as you know, also with the entrusting of the region to the Artacids of Armenia for a while. But he was eventually defeated by Antiochus VII. We're talking 142, 139 BC. But his coinage, Tryphon's coinage struck at Antioch and other mints, frequently displays, again, the uncrested Thracian helmet as a personal badge. Though one Ephesus figure wears actually a helmet of the latter form. And so actually what these guys wore as helmets is the least of our concerns. It could be even an iconographic standard for political reasons. At the time, surely there were different influences. Say, but that helmet comes more from that kind of cultural background, so we're adopting it, whatever. It had to do with the fashion of the time. But if we're talking about the same phalangites, there would have been all kind of variety imaginable, right? And also with practically no effect, in the sense that helmets did pretty much all the same thing, regardless of the type. And mostly were varying on the availability, the local availability, styles of trade, local production, whatever, right? And in any case, they were worn as a standard by the troops. The head is the sort of most important part to protect in combat for the effectiveness of a soldier, of a unit, of an army. And we can imagine the great variety that still, in style, it still basically gets down to, you have a metal armor head when you go in combat, which is the only thing that actually matters here from a strictly apological point of view. Now, the aforementioned Ephesus warriors, by the way, I couldn't use this either, right, in the video, but you get a gist of that in the AI imagery, may reflect the appearance as well of the Argyraspides, the famed Seleucid guard infantry expected to present a more Hellenic aspect with bare legs, greaves, and crests. This is incredibly important because the Argyraspides, in their Silver Age inspiration, right, so the divine derivation, as you know, that there were all the variants, that were the Chalkaspides, we'll look at them later. There was this idea in the phalanx of this progression from divinity, right, of typical perennial, traditional form, where the most elite units were the ones actually, first of all, more affluent, so they had more status, and could, in this sense, also by ancestry, associate themselves with an Hellenic origin, with a Macedonian origin, and would thus tend to wear more, as we were saying before, the Macedonian way. So you have an Attic helmet is much more Hellenic than, say, a Thracian one, for example. Bare legs, as opposed to Persian trousers. So also, well, greaves that were an expansive device, crests that were also typical, again, of the earlier Macedonian style. Right. So the Argyraspides would definitely be conceived as the metaphysical instantiation of a Macedonian force, right? Whereas other phalanges, like the rank and file one, would again, with stereotype today, was somehow more barbarian looking, and partially also by blood descending from, because again, that were all these Macedonian settlers at some point would take some local women as their brides. Now, these troops, the Argyraspides, fought, and we will make an entire video about the Argyraspides, because here we are making just like Seleucid phalangites, so they can't be anyone. It was fighting on the Macedonian pikeman style, as sarissophoros, as pezhetairos. There are different semantic shades associated with the definitions, meant practically the same thing in terms of unit identification. Because there is really a very interesting set of information about who these people were, and so we will better characterize them in a single video. But today we will also look at it as far as their phalangitic gear is concerned. And apart from an uncertain reference to a forced march in Bactria, the region that, again, we've been covering in northern Afghanistan and southern Central Asia, that formed the easternmost satrapy of the Seleucid realm until its secession under the Deodote dynasty around 250 BC, when Deodotus declared independence amid the turmoil following the death of Antiochus II. With its capital at Bactra, modern Balkh, it possessed this rich agricultural land watered by the Oxus and had been settled with, as we're recounting, Hellenic military colonists under Alexander and the early Seleucids. The revolt coinciding with the almost simultaneous, by the way, Parthian secession under Arsaces I, both facilitated by the distraction of the Third Syrian War. There's already the Parthians have settled in places like Hyrcania, and so they're technically subjects of the empire, but these northeastern satrapies are starting to break off from the war, the wolf wars. Well, in this expedition that we're aware of, from the west to reclaim those lands, the Argyraspides are rarely attested on mobile operations of the kind once performed by Alexander's Hypaspists, right? They were not, for example, employed when Antiochus III the Great reigned from 223 to 187 and restored much of the empire's eastern territories through his own anabasis of 212-205 that reasserted control over Armenia, Parthia, and Bactria before reaching the borders of India, stormed mountain passes. Naturally, we don't know much about what was happening. There is this, again, big question mark regarding many details of this broader Eastern Oriental perceived force, right? That gets much less documented, especially in the bowels of the Middle East, of Central Asia even. There is, however, no reason to suppose that the Argyraspides possessed an alternative lighter armament in the Alexandrian style. We say this because the Hypaspists were, at some point, both pikemen and some kind of assault troops. The Argyraspides, as we'll see now, instead in the Seleucid, were essentially the equivalent of that originary guard unit, or actually had expanded into something also broader. Normally, as we'll see now, in the 10,000 scale, or not fixed, normally they were up to 10,000, in fact, had become, generally speaking, the phalanx, or the crack force of the phalanx as such. And so they had mostly become heavier, more rigidly framed in this collective training of the Macedonian style phalanx. Because, of course, also the Macedonian phalanx developed. I made some videos explaining how this over time. These were troops fighting, as we said, just all basically on the same basis, on the same bedrock, from the same Macedonian style phalanx mold. But aside from the fact that, say, even though this is a very peculiar type of fighting, there isn't much of a difference even with the rest of heavy infantry in the world when we really want to be very concrete, when you look at military expendability, balance, etc. But of course, every army was different, right? Even within the same diadochi, there were different styles, directions, but at every campaign, like even during the same campaign, armies change, right? We know from Polybius that the Sarissa lengthened after Alexander. There was an experiment in the early diadochi period to lengthen the Sarissa further. Polybius, the 2nd century BC Achaean historian, born around 200 BC at Megalopolis, whose detailed accounts of Hellenistic warfare draw on both autopsy and earlier sources, and who himself served as cavalry commander in the Achaean League before his detention in Rome. He wrote his histories to explain Rome's rise to Mediterranean dominance, including against the phalanx, records a length of 14 cubits, right? So there is all the question in historiography, what kind of cubits were these? The Attic one or the Macedonian one? So we will make an entire video about this, because the sarissa is, again, such a central weapon indeed in Macedonian warfare, for the pezhetairos and the sarissophoros as such. And my personal opinion, and one I think dominating in historiography, is really that we're talking about the Macedonian cubits, right? The Attic ones were like 45 centimeters, the Macedonian ones like 35, right? So on the basis of the former measure that was sometimes taken, like people think that Sari could be more than 6 or even 7 meters long, right? But as a matter of fact, they didn't even reach, according to the Macedonian cubit, 5 meters. It was something like 4.9, right? that were, as we'll see now, the ones that fundamentally remained. That's how long actually a sarissa was. Like we're talking 4.5 meters, 5 meters. In the 2nd century, this had been the standard, right? Had settled itself as a standard. But there was this earlier figure given by an anecdote of Apollonius that makes it 16 cubits. That would be also in Macedonian cubits, something like 5.4 meters of something. Apollonius was a 2nd century AD Macedonian author of the Stratagems, compiled under the Antonine emperors and preserving numerous tactical anecdotes drawn from earlier lost histories. They're not such important sources in a construed way. I mean, Polybius is much more systematic. These were just collections of different numbers, etc. And it's useful because it gives you the number, but he doesn't tell us either what kind of cubit that was. We're just told that it had referred to the early 3rd century. So we're talking basically the generation after Alexander. And that greater length appears to have been tried and found too unwieldy and therefore discarded to this greater standard of not even 5 meters long. Right? This also tells you how actually non-overwhelmingly special so the phalanx really was, because the more you lengthen the sarissa and sort of the more this changes a huge deal, right? We have to recover the idea of the Macedonian phalanges actually being much more into the actual fray in some pretty bloody fashion, right? We do know that, of course, they weren't as aggressive or warlike or tribal-backed or primitive like a Roman legionnaire that literally threw himself into the Saracen forest. But and even though they were primarily not, of course, trained to fight into hand-to-hand, say with a sword, right? At that range, the hand-to-hand combat was pretty intense and pretty darn bloody against this presumption that I know they just poked each other in an almost bloodless way until somebody outflanked them on the other side. That's not how combat works to begin with, let alone looking at sources that tell us, really do not tell us, in fact, this more secular and modern obsession for presuming that warfare is about fighting without losses. It's the most outrageous insanity that one can think. And that does not make war a bad thing per se. As a matter of fact, if anything, you must be ready to fight wars with that very clear in mind, instead of whining at every loss for no reason. Now, the heavy-weighted butt spike, the counterweighted portion noted by Polybius, is attested on the Pergamon reliefs. These were sculptural monuments we mentioned before from the Attalid capital in northwestern Asia Minor that illustrate contemporary military equipment carved during the reign of Eumenes II after the victory over the Galatians, and reflecting equipment captured or observed in Seleucid service as well. The great altar of Pergamon and associated reliefs was executed under the same ruler. We're talking 197, 159 BC, include detailed description of arms and armor that really closely match literally descriptions of Hellenistic equipment, interestingly enough. So archaeology confirming what historiography actually already stated, and almost certainly incorporates these trophies from the Galatian wars and the war with Antiochus III as well. As you know, the Attalids had sided with Rome, right? And so you have there also probably the peak of, in fact, I made a video about the Seleucid cataphract, yet another very old video, and you know that there is pretty unequivocal gear displayed among the trophies of Pergamon. And if you know the Battle of Magnesia, if you have an idea of sort of what kind of forces the Seleucids deployed there, I also made a video again there explaining in my master degree, so not the master degree thesis, but one of the theses from my master time, the old battles between the Macedonian phalanx and the Roman legion. You find an adequate description of all of that. Naturally, having a counterweight was important for such a long spear. The conventional shield of the Seleucid phalanx measured some 45 centimeters in diameter, leaving both hands free to manage the pike. right? You can have historically pike units. I discussed this in my video about the pavesiers that are very often a radically misunderstood unit. People think that pavesiers were just guys that protected others or themselves with their shields for shooting. Again, this is not what pavesiers were for a great part, even the peak phase of their historical employ. As a matter of fact, there were shields also used in hand-to-hand combat, and even by pikemen with both hands, slung on their shoulders in that case. Here, the fact that shields were so small had to do with the overall functionality of the phalanx, that as a broader formation was the major protection you could get. There was this distance indeed between the pikemen, so it was actually pretty intense, savage hand-to-hand bloodshed, as we were saying before, but at the same time worked more on the handling of the pike than the defense of the shield. It's very small. There had been larger shields historically used by the same phalange. If you look at also the aforementioned Hypaspists and their commando operations, like of course they use even traditional political shields of some sort. This thing went on for a long time. I've seen it also in other cultures that did not fight even in the classical Hellenic phalanx, but used hoplitic armament, like the Etruscans, the early Romans. I made lots of videos about that. You have to realize how actually primitive and materially poor even these great empires' times actually were in antiquity, right? If this like linothorax without metal or 45 centimeters shield in diameter seemed to you scarce protection, aside from what we already said about collective training being way more important than being loaded in defensive, in armor, consider that there wasn't literally any other people that the Macedons and the Diadochoi, in the sense, fought against that was heavier than them, right? You could find, of course, smaller picked units were ultra heavily armored. Also, the Macedons had that. But say this block of tens of thousands of men already equipped with this type of armor was literally the most heavily armored, larger force you could find out there. And so in and of itself was something utterly insane, and primarily not just because they were armored, because again, that wasn't even that much needed, as we recounted before. There weren't probably even the resources to do that, but because the sheer traumatically astronomical cost of the phalanx derived mostly from the training of this pikemen to maintain formation in an aggressive tactic, right? And that was the actual issue, right? And nobody ever broke the phalanx frontally. Remember that. Not even the Romans, right? The only instance would be Pydna, because Polybius says that the phalanx had already disarticulated itself by itself, which is not even likely what really happened during the battle. But we do not have any single evidence whatsoever of a Macedonian phalanx having ever been broken frontally, including by other Macedons, as a matter of fact, unless, again, we go on by attrition or something like that. But it's mostly, again, flank maneuvers and eventually bring to the end of this, while these guys were killing each other in a pretty gruesome fashion, because they were truly meant to be unstoppable in a way. Not much because of a technicality of which kind of weapons they use. That weapons are made by tactics, not the other way around. The other way around is minimal in the history of technology and military history. Weapons adapt to tactics, do not create tactics, right? Now, the largest core of the Seleucid army remained indeed the one of the phalanx itself, so the pezhetairos, the sarissophoros, the Macedons, however you want to call it, stationed in the center of the line in every major engagement, and occasionally termed the heavy troops tabareaton oplon, which literally means the heavy parts of the armor / weapons, or more idiomatically in military context, the heavy equipment or the heavy arms, right? As you know, oplon is a pretty broad terminology of arm, right? You can apply just like the arm that eventually comes from Latin, but say modern English and also other languages indeed. Tabare is the neutral plural adjective of the heavy things or heavy parts. Ton oplon is the genitive plural of oplon, which broadly means tools, equipment, weapons, or armor, the root word for hoplite as well. And so In historical military texts, such as those by Polybius or Xenophon, this phrase is standard shorthand for a soldier's heavy equipment kit. It wasn't even about the Macedons historically, it came also from classical antiquity, specifically referring to the heavy defensive armor, shields, and primary weapons like the heavy bronze or iron gear, as opposed to lighter mobile gear. Right? So the phalangite was this by this video's time. The status passed from father to son and could be conferred on non-Macedonians who had served the dynasty as mercenaries or in other capacities. Consider that there were lots of Western mercenaries still, and that there were other ways to integrate these guys, in fact, into eventually the Macedonian force. That was the same phalanx, right? Rendering, in fact, the designation in practice a pseudo-ethnic, but still ethnic one, genuine descendants of the Macedonians who had fought under Alexander and then under Seleucus I formed still the core of the Seleucid military system. Right. Now, there is an interesting historiographical debate, because when we make this historical military unit series, we're looking at the sort of the whole picture. Who were these people, right? And so there is a debate regarding how did actually military colonies work in these empires. I have a particular idea I highlighted before, and the system is really simple, right? It's not much just a rigid definition of colonies or something technical, whatever. It's literally these sort of communes that were, again, they were enjoying this freer, higher status, and that were constituted by these sort of the descendants of the actual conquerors of the Achaemenid Empire. And when, of course, there was a general threat to their predominance, they all accepted to serve in the imperial army, as they were called by the monarch, that also sort of co-opted some of them. There was all a system of social cultural promotion, politically, and governance, etc. So the system obviously successfully fueled itself, and indeed the Seleucid Empire represents the most powerful military at this point in history, before the Romans took over. Now, you have we'll talk this better again in a bit about the Seleucid army organization, also the one of other countries. Look at that video that I made about the Ptolemaic army. There is something to it, even though in Egypt things again went downhill pretty fast, pretty badly, and so that the entire system did not really hold very much for different reasons. But the Seleucid one was pretty advanced. Yet again, how categorically defined it was, it's something object of historiographical debate. Katoikai were small settlements planted on crown land and divided into allotments for katoikoi. Katoikoi literally refers to the settlers, the inhabitants or dwellers of a given place, right? Derived from kata, that is down in, plus oikos, house, home, right? So it was just similar to military colonies, right? Except like of Rome. I mean that, however, as Roman colonies normally did not imply military service because they were historically settled already on troubled frontiers. There is some overlap in this context. That's why, in part, also these colonies were military functional on their own. But every community historically had their own autonomous military organization. The important part is that this was part of a broader net, right? Also, the Hellenic polis had their own pretty well-equipped forces, heavier cavalry. We've seen it also as far as the Seleucids are concerned. The cities of Syria, for example, who were richer, etc., they feel pretty good, pretty heavily armored troops. But being part of a professional system that routinely goes at war and gains that habit properly of organization, but aptitude to combat, garners experience, esprit de corps. It's something very different, and in this case, it works on the basis of the phalanx. It is truly the strongest army that the world has ever seen up to this point. Now, although many katoikoi may have been military colonists, there is no direct institutional link between the grant of a kleros and obligatory phalanx service. Kleros literally translates to lot or allotment, derived from the ancient practice of distributing plots of land to settlers by casting lots. Naturally, the meaning of this is, and for telling you how much these classical empires actually were very similar to the feudal ones, right? The feudal realms of the Middle Ages is that the underlying principle is that the Macedonians had conquered the world, right? They were a God-chosen race. They effectively lorded over this wide variety of peoples. They had naturally maintained the privilege as much as the duty of bearing arms. And as we explained before, there wasn't much simply of a need to enforce obedience from the side of a monarchy. Even such a highly pronounced one, so sort of authoritarianly leaning one, also one steeped in a very high sense of holy war. I also made a video about the how Hellenistic mentality, right, influenced Crusader warfare down this sort of through also the myth of Alexander that was, as you know, the most portrayed here in the Middle Ages, right? In the Western Middle Ages, I mean the Islamic one. So the proof that we don't have this imposition is not very different from the one of, I don't know, a Frankish king that respected his freemen, his aristocratic freemen in this sense. The same goes for Rome. Like that would have followed the leader just out of what he could reward them with, right? Out of military exploits. So this is the point. The ancient world didn't need a great deal of bureaucracy to work. The term katoikia denoted, therefore, this military or / civilian as well, colonists on royal land, often strategically placed to control routes or frontiers. Obviously, they had a military function in this, but there were also, of course, civilians living there. It wasn't just a military colony, simply a garrison. Some were garrisons, as we'll see now, but let's say we're more like local settlers that were using garrison function as opposed to sort of living in a sort of garrison-like, I want to come back. No, these people were properly settled there. They had families and everything, and they sustained themselves with also an adequate equipment, if anything, to defend the community itself. The associated land allotment, the kleros, provided economic support, in fact, but did not automatically impose hereditary military duty either, in the manner sometimes assumed. I mean, the hereditarity of this stemmed from genetic metaphysics, right? If you had the privilege of being a freeman of a Macedonia, a warrior, so you would use that to rule over this land. And it's kind of obvious. That's nothing more, nothing less what Europeans did during colonialism. And so it's the same identical God-given right to rule the world that the Megas had incarnated to the utmost of leadership. And so this was just given for granted. I mean, you've seen it. We've seen it in many other videos about the Hellenistic world, also in the later Roman times. The Hellenes, even when conquered by the Romans, were still basically under them the master race of the rest of this enormous world. Like, none of the other societies were as organized as the Hellenic one. The Hellenes were richer, more powerful, more influent. They ran the system. And this stemmed, of course, from Alexander's conquest. They had been deeply ingrained as the leadership, right, the establishment of the former lands they conquered. It's not very different from what the Achaemenids had done by conquering all these places before, by the way. Katoikoi in the Hellenistic East acquired a technical sense distinct from the classical metoikoi or the contemporary paroikoi. A katoikia was a restricted settlement on crown land whose inhabitants, though not physically resident in a neighboring city-state, enjoyed certain rights of participation in its life as well, right? And like landowners. Other vocabulary note here, metoikoi, the metics, were the resident aliens or foreigners living inside an Hellenic city-state, polis, who paid taxes and had legal rights but could not own land or fully participate politically, right? Second-class citizens. The paroikoi were instead tenants, neighbors, or subdwellers living beside or on the outskirts of a community, typically holding lower social or economic status than full citizens or settlers, right? So this tells you how important indeed these pezhetairos were in practice, also in this broader Eastern society. Because remember, also, this is a very different place from Hellas itself, needless to say, but in many So in a really big, wide, and varied fashion, right? We could make a video about the geography of the Seleucid military colonies. It would be really interesting to see how far they arrive. I mean, if you look at Alexander's travels, if you look at the east, again, this had at some point become the Seleucid Empire itself. A detachment of phalangites recorded in the treaty between Smyrna and Magnesia, two important cities of Western Asia Minor, that concluded a detailed agreement of mutual citizenship and military cooperation in the mid-3rd century BC under the reign of Seleucus II Callinicos, and the son of Antiochus II, who struggled to maintain cohesion during the Third Syrian War and the simultaneous revolt of his brother Antiochus Hierax, as garrisoning Palai Magnesia under an officer named Timon, received the same exemption from tithes already enjoyed by the older garrison settlers, confirming that they themselves were katoikoi, identified solely by their military affiliation. Right? Naturally, this is a Western example because the West is better documented, and this tells you essentially what we're pointing out before. Of course, we know much less of these agreements in much less literate and developed places the more east you went into Asia. The Smyrna Magnesia Treaty, preserved on stone, by the way, illustrates the complex web of local alliances and royal garrisons that characterized Seleucid Asia Minor during the troubled reign of Seleucus II, 246-226 BC. Besides, the details of that agreement, we could make maybe a little video on it, is that these men were resident Helleno-Macedonian military settlers rather than mercenaries, because the inscription lists them without the separate cash pay guaranteed to hired troops, proving instead that they were local farmer soldiers drafted by lot who had to be legally threatened to stay at their posts because a severe land shortage left the king unable to compensate them for abandoning their private land allotments. As we've seen, what was the international situation, so this thing could actually happen. Of course, there were lots of wars, and so the various colonists at some point had difficulties in keeping, for example, to garrison these communities. Right, there are very long. This is very interesting. Think about even up to Justinian's Limitane, that start disappearing. Like the forms of military colonization. Right here, you have the Seleucids, then you have the Romans, etc. Like so, were a practice that survives further through many other different military systems, military political rules. And that is perhaps to be much more considered, because you also wonder, you all know about the Macedonian phalangites, the Roman legionaries, but the question is also how were they actually sustained? Like the hierarchy of power, what were these empires about? They were essentially one specific nation taking over the world in a hierarchical fashion over all the rest of the people, and living off also the same defense and resources of these individuals. This is pretty much what we see also continuously throughout the Middle Ages and all forms of social military organizations. They are very important to understand because they make you understand also how not much of a difference technically existed in pre-industrial times in general, for us to appreciate how precious even these resources really were and how qualitative these troops really were. Speaking of the various units that these phalangites could constitute rather than to be drawn from, because it was the other way around, right? You would think, like in a total war game, you have all these set of units. Once you recruit them, they're always the same people, and they stay there until you disband or whatever. But in actual fact, the elite units at some point were not temporary in the sense that they always remain the same organic. And many of the individuals that made them up were actually extracted from the finest men of these colonies without further regimentation within a local unit as such, right? It wasn't like, the colony of the Argyraspides, right? The Argyraspides were equipped also through the more concentrated means of of the monarchy, etc., from the best troops that also would bring their own best equipment from the various colonies and serving in some also systemically and organically effective and structured way during campaigns. Now, the elite regiment of the pezhetairos were the Argyraspides, or silver shields. We discussed them before. They originated as the Hypaspists, corps of Alexander. Basically changed name, right? You don't find the Hypaspists in the Seleucid army as such, right? And you realize that the function was essentially carried out by the same Argyraspides. They were the same people that had just changed name. They received such name due to their silver shields, and the new title was acquired in particular on the eve of the Indian campaign and later passed into the service of Seleucus I after the corps was dispersed by Antigonus Monophthalmus following the Battle of Gabiene in 316. Because, of course, all these names, all these concepts of, say, silver shield existed, of course, in the older Macedonian system. The Battle of Gabiene was this dusty engagement in central Iran where the veteran unit's betrayal sealed Eumenes' fate. At Gabiene, the silver shields, veterans of Alexander's campaigns now serving under Eumenes of Cardia, delivered the baggage train containing their families and accumulated wealth into Antigonus's hands, after which many transferred allegiance. Seleucus, that's how it started for the Seleucids, subsequently incorporated the survivors into his own forces. You know that phase is pretty complicated. At some point I could launch a series literally on the Diadochoi proper. It would be really interesting from a military standpoint. At Raphia in 217, the major battle, the Fourth Syrian War, fought near Gaza on June the 22nd. This is the largest pitched battle of the Hellenistic age in terms of numbers engaged, by the way, in which Antiochus III was defeated, this is a Seleucid defeat, by Ptolemy IV of Egypt after an engagement that saw the Seleucid right wing succeed while the center collapsed under the weight of the Ptolemaic phalanx, including native Egyptian troops. I discussed those in the video about the Ptolemaic army organization, if you're interested. And it's also what we're telling before, that we actually have these pushes between phalanxes that at some point are actually able to knock each other out. If anything, the odds were level there in terms of technical capacity. The Ptolemaic decision to arm and train native Egyptian machimoi as phalangites proved crushing in the center, while Antiochus' successful cavalry charge on the right proved insufficient instead. The Argyraspides numbered 10,000 men, chosen from the whole kingdom and armed in the Macedonian manner. Polybius later calls them the picked men of the Syrians, as a matter of fact. And by Syrians, of course, here we mean those who rule Syria, so this Syro-Macedonian establishment. Their tactical role placed them beside the phalanx against both the Ptolemaic phalanx, so the phalanx of the more average pezhetairos, right? So these were picked units. It was a picked phalanx, a higher grade phalanx. And so not evidently simply a guard, right? Against both the Ptolemaic phalanx, in this case at Raphia, against the Roman legions at Magnesia, and among others, in the Daphne Parade of 165 BC. This is also a very famous event because we have pretty significant data from this parade where we find we'll talk about it now, the Romanized infantry. In fact, it seems that half of the Argyraspides were at some point in this phase of great drastic reduction of the effective Seleucid power turned into some kind of Thoracitae, and we'll talk about it now, but we'll also make an entire video about the Thoracitae. If you're interested, I also discussed this in a video about the Turophoroi. If you look at the Sidon stela that I also used in the thumbnail, that is a very famous piece of either Seleucid or Ptolemaic, but it's the same in this sense. In fact, military style of what the Turophoroi were, all the story, you're acquainted with that, I think, if you've watched my video in particular, that are wearing chainmail. And the reason here is that the resources to maintain the phalanx as a system had collapsed because of the drastic shrinking of the empire to de facto Syria only from that massive territory. And the information that we have, even about armored elephants, or something like that, it derives from there. This was, in fact, a grand military and religious festival staged by Antiochus IV Epiphanes at the suburb of Antioch, sacred to Apollo. Epiphanes is also a nickname earned because of such things, like the fact that he had to properly manifest in an overt way his divine power, right, through his military. This was, again, a dedication to Apollo in 166-165 BC, in emulation of the games organized by Aemilius Paulus after Pydna, so the crushing Roman victory over the Macedonian phalanx, the Antigonid phalanx, and as a demonstration of restored Seleucid power after the humiliation of the Day of Eleusis. The Day of Eleusis was the historical moment in 168 BC when the Roman ambassador Gaius Popilius Laenas forced the Seleucid king Antiochus IV to hold his invasion of Egypt by drawing a circle around him in the sand and demanding an answer before he stepped out of it, effectively signaling the absolute dominance that Rome already exercised over the Hellenistic kingdom in a meaningful international fashion. And at Daphne, there are voices of sort of 50,000 troops and vast quantities of treasure displayed. Likely there was less of that, but say it was a way to show the full might of the Seleucid army. But we know the Argyraspides standing within the ranks of the phalanx there, so surviving essentially effectively from Alexander's time into the Seleucid army up to this sort of this is not the very end, there's another century of Seleucid rule, but it's a painful moment enough. Livy, the Roman historian of the late 1st century BC, whose account of the Syrian war draws on Polybius, styles these Argyraspides of Daphne as the royal cohort, right? The Regia cohorts. And this is very important because there is this, again, sense of antediluvian, right, divine manifestation in the idea of the silver of the Argyraspides, and they're here allegedly being, again, 10,000 were only 5,000. In fact, 10,000 golden shields, the Chrysaspides, that it was sort of an excess, and again, we will not here digress on the Daphne parade because it's somehow complicated also just because of the incredibility of it all. But there were the 5,000 bronze shields, the Chalkaspides, and then the 5,000 silver shields, the Argyraspides, right? And there is this presence of 5,000 elite troops armed and equipped the Roman fashion that would have been probably, considering that the Argyraspides had always been 10,000, now probably the reformation of part of this infantry in the Roman model, right? This happened in different powers, the Numidians, the Armenians, they all have this quote-unquote Romanized infantry. It's not much like they were, in some cases, were literally trained by Roman instructors, etc., but there is also a gradual development of these forces toward the basic model had been there, right? Guys in chainmail, as we mostly connected with the Celts, which is correct, but let's say also actually the earliest evidence of chainmail is among the Etruscans. There's this sense that everybody copied everybody else to get arms and armor. I mean, we're talking about Iron Age technology, right? They all had that, right? And in general, everybody looked pretty darn similar. Here, if anything, what you want to appreciate is that toward the end of Hellenistic warfare, there were some kind of innovations, adaptations that are a bit of a mirage. In this case, probably due to the fact that maintaining the Argyraspides as a phalanx cost too much, and so there was the scaling down to actually some cheaper type of troop like the Romanized infantry would have been. Because again, in order to make the phalanx work, you're going to have a massive edge, frontal in particular, but you must be really extracting an enormity of resources. At this point, the Seleucids do not quite really have anymore, nor this Romanized infantry was sort of the same level of the Roman legions in terms of quality, we can think, even though we don't have to think necessarily that they were bad soldiers either at all. The Seleucid military was still relevant at this point. Now, the Argyraspides were the sons of military settlers, young men still in the prime of life who had not yet inherited their father's allotments and could therefore be kept under arms at the center of the kingdom. And so there were some kind of, not hostages, but it was a fostering system where obviously the children of the better fathers could be maintained at the expenses of the king and kept in this incredibly magnificent way, also with the support of the fathers for that matter, that would have had to properly equip them, fit them, also as they arrived there by some degree. It was sure some exchange of some. So it was a system of favors, of clientary relations, and so on. After a fixed term, so they were extracted, by the way, from, as we were saying before, the wall of Seleucid military colonies, also from pretty far away. After a fixed term of service, they returned to the settlements and entered the reserve ranks of the ordinary phalanx, right, thereby maintaining the military standard of the settler community. So imagine the kind of prestige, of awe, of general sense of belonging and pride, and just the experience that had garnered as the better element of the phalanx. This is essentially a crack force constituting a sensible section of the entire pezhetairos. This is really important for maintaining that kind of moral cohesion also across the empire. Within this larger, effectively guard corps, because they also were normally stationed next to the king, a smaller crack force of Hypaspists, numbering perhaps 2,000 and corresponding to the old Agema, is attested accompanying the king in outflanking maneuvers at the siege of Sardis, the ancient Lydian capital in western Asia Minor that became a key Seleucid stronghold after its capture, in fact, from the rebel Achaeus in 213, following a prolonged investment that ended with the betrayal of the citadel. This is where the Seleucids are consolidating power in the Aegean. They were also crossing to Greece to face the Romans, as the Antigonids also were still there and allied with Rome. With its formidable Acropolis, this place had been the seat of the same Achaemenid satrapy of Lydia, and later the center of Achaeus' short-lived independent kingdom. Its fall restored Seleucid control west of the Taurus until the Treaty of Apamea. So the Hypaspists were still there as some lighter, smaller force, right? Lighter in the sense that they were actually picked and they were elite. And most elite, the old Agema, but in a way that was more exchangeable. The phalanx. We'll see now better who the peltasts were, right? Actually, heavy infantry unit had been called like that, even though the term originally meant to properly throw away cheap skirmishers in Hellenic warfare, because of this increased mobility. Normally, the Agema, the Hypaspists could fight, as it had already been the case under Alexander's, both pikemen and some commando forces. The Hypaspists were present within the Argyraspides at Panion, the crushing battle 200 BC near the sources of the Jordan, near the sanctuary of Pan, in fact, at the foot of Mount Hermon, that we also addressed in our videos about perennial tradition. It's the last video that I made about the Enochian tradition, in which Antiochus III defeated the Ptolemaic forces under Scopas of Aetolia by outmaneuvering them and exploiting the terrain around the Banias Springs, permanently transferring Coele Syria from Ptolemaic to Seleucid hands. Very important battle in the Syrian wars. Polybius occasionally applies the Antigonid term, because it was also more influenced, of course, from Hellas, peltasts, to these very Hypaspist troops, especially when describing the 10,000 selected for the forced march against Euthydemus in Bactria. Right, their presence among the phalangites in the order of march across the Elburz, the mountain range south of the Caspian Sea that Antiochus III crossed during his eastern expedition in 209 while pursuing the Parthian king Arsaces II through the passes leading into Hyrcania, shows the designation did not imply lighter equipment at all, because 10,000 men, even though they were accompanied by cavalry, were essentially the hammer and anvil combined arms complement of the Macedonian forces. You couldn't have any lighter element, also because you would have here you lack other heavy infantry as such. And this is very important because it shows you that the term peltast is essentially applied to some sort of more mobile force that could, at that point, be used in this tough terrain as a more mobile one, with some more assault capacity, not necessarily the unwieldy phalanx that naturally upland has greater difficulties. The Alberts crossing formed part of Antiochus III's great eastern anabasis. So obviously, as Alexander showed, crossing these territories with a fully fledged Macedonian phalanx was perfectly fine, but he also had more flexible troops in some ways. We've seen it also as far as his Bactrian campaigns, right? And in this expedition, Antiochus, that was nicknamed Megas himself, because he's, again, one of the greatest commanders in the history of mankind, and a war heir to Alexander, compelled the Parthian king to acknowledge Seleucid suzerainty before continuing into Bactria to confront Euthydemus I. There were other heavy Macedonian troops in Bactria, right? Now, why peltasts, by the way? Exactly because of that increased agility. The standard Macedonian shield that we've seen of 45 centimeters could itself be called a pelte in an unspecific sense, and the Argyraspides carried pikes and shields no less substantial than those of the line phalanx. So even though they could definitely switch weapons in some specific operations, the fact that they're called peltasts in Hellenic obviously has nothing to do with any kind of lighter infantry or skirmisher. They were heavies and were essentially some of the finest forces that, in fact, Antiochus would take with him, with a pretty big. They're 10,000, right? But they are very evidently tactically complete on their own. They know their deal. Breastplates, whether linen or leather, were more readily supplied and maintained for the permanent guard than for the distant settlers, you can imagine. At the Daphne parade, the phalanx itself numbered 20,000 Macedonians, exclusive of the 5,000 Chalkaspides and the Argyraspides. The text of Polybius describing the Daphne parade, transmitted through a single manuscript of Athenaios, the Hellenic rhetorician and author of the Deipnosophists, writing around 200 AD, who preserves extensive excerpts from earlier historians in a work structured as a series of learned conversations at a banquet. So we're also quite fortunate to have it compiled in the early 3rd century AD. It is the sole surviving source for many fragments of Hellenistic historians and technical writers, containing a lacuna that leaves, however, unfortunately uncertain whether the 20,000 Macedonians included or excluded the Chalkaspides and Argyraspides. The presence of the conjunction "and" between the Macedonians and the Chalkaspides, in fact, makes it probable that the figure is exclusive, so that the Macedonian phalanx represents the reservists mobilized from throughout the empire, right? No further regimental names need be restored into the lacuna. The Chalkaspides, a title otherwise confined to the Antigonid army, were designated the principal bronze-shielded Chalkis, that is, the bronze phalanx of the Macedonian kings. So this was a step down in the hierarchy, right? You have also the golden shielded phalangites that were not sort of a thing actually just in this parade for the sake of display. But you have the finest are the elite within the Argyraspides anyway. And it, again, otherwise, the bronze-shielded phalanx of the Macedonian kings were present in the same Macedonia until the destruction of the Antigonid army itself at Pydna in 168. Very famous battle, obviously not fought on June 22nd. I made a video about the Antigonid army organization, so you can check that out a little. That's how the Third Macedonian War ended, together with the Antigonid dynasty, when Lucius Aemilius Paulus shattered The formation of Perseus, the collapse of the Macedonian phalanx under Roman pressure, became a classic illustration of the formation's vulnerability once its cohesion was broken, at least according to the... this is true, but say, as I was hinting at before, we're not 100% sure this is fundamentally what happened. If you read Polybius' account, you understand how sort of rationalizing it is and how not specific. Like, a Roman would have never written the battle in those terms. Now, the Chalkaspides appear only once in Seleucid sources. It may represent either an attempt to perpetuate a Macedonian regimental name after the destruction of the Antigonid force at Pydna, which would be interesting, especially as they didn't like the Romans very much, or an earlier experiment in Macedonian-style reform, undertaken by the aforementioned Antiochus IV. Again, we learned of them at Daphne. Or by his predecessor Seleucus IV. Maybe they were already there. In fact, he reigned from 187 to 175, so this is after Antiochus III, Magnesia and everything, and focused on consolidating the realm after the Treaty of Apamea, which had stripped the empire of its war elephants, limited its navy, and imposed a heavy indemnity of 15,000 talents payable over 12 years. Seleucus IV Philopator devoted much of his reign to the financial recovery required by this burden, constraining military expenditure until Antiochus IV's more ambitious program that we've seen here in display. After Pydna, the Chalkaspides unit may have been reconstituted again in the Seleucid army, in part from Macedonian exiles themselves, right, and professional soldiers who fled the defeated kingdom, or it may have been disbanded as Romanization advanced, anyway, as also the Daphne parade shows, next to the Chalkaspides anyway. No independent regiment of Chrysaspides is securely attested. The rhetorical reference in 1 Maccabees to bronze and gold shields at Beth-Zacharia, the battle of 162 BC south of Jerusalem, in which the forces of Lucius confronted Judas Maccabeus in Judea during the early stages of the Maccabean revolt after the death of Antiochus IV, employing elephants against the Jewish forces, is insufficient to establish its existence, right? The description of gleaming, because we've seen them at Daphne, right? And so the idea is, were these just parade troops? I mean, nobody has heard of Chrysaspides, right? The description of gleaming shields in the biblical passage belongs to the rhetorical style of the source rather than precise military inventory. References to Chrysaspides outside the dubious onomasticon of Pollux of Naucratis, who was a 2nd century AD lexicographer whose work was compiled to supply recherché vocabulary for display at dinner parties and to secure imperial patronage under Commodus, so you can imagine the context, actually lack any Seleucid context. The only historically attested regiment of that name was formed, yes, but when? By a few decades later, not of the 2nd century BC or the 3rd AD, by Severus Alexander, in imitation of Alexander the Great before his Sasanian campaign in 232. I would look at that at some point, because the Romans did this at some point. They were just some sort of token, but sometimes they actually even fought, but say the same Nero at some point, we know, sent troops in the east, equipped as Spartan warriors, but equipped with sarissai, interestingly enough. But of course, we know who dominated the war at the time, and it cannot be projected. We cannot project, in fact, this information backwards. Like saying, okay, since Severus Alexander used some golden shields without any reference to the Seleucids, by the way, just because his homonymous Alexander the Great had done so, or at least what had been attributed, that is another story. Attributed by the Romans. Obviously, it was all part of the Neoplatonic, symbolic, divinizing perennial view of the time. You don't have to be surprised by that. Now, under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, that as we've seen reigned from 175 to 164, and pursued this sort of reactionary as energetic policy of cultural Hellenization and military modernization after spending over a decade as a hostage in Rome himself, interestingly enough, following the Treaty of Apamea. His years as a hostage exposed him to Roman military methods and institutional practices, which he later sought to adapt within a still fundamentally Hellenistic framework. The mentioned contingent of 5,000 men in the prime of life appeared Daphne armed in the Roman fashion with male cuirasses, right? I would like to point out that we will make distinct military historical unit videos for all of these, the Argyraspides, the Chalkaspides. There are the Seleucids as well, are not present in the Seleucid army, but in the Antigonid, yes. Also these Romanized infantry, not just from the Seleucids, as a matter of fact. But they are interesting here because while not phalangites, they may have actually come from some phalangitic colonies, right, in the previous generations, or even maybe some of them had already knew how to fight as phalangites to begin with. These were young Syro-Macedonian conscripts recently trained in manipular tactics, like the ones that Antiochus had sort of learned of in Rome, just like, I don't know, Polybius was there. And so we're in this time of major Roman hegemony that came to humiliate, in fact, the same Antiochus further. And they were not mercenaries either, right? There were some troops that fought already that kind of Romanizing way. We'll talk about those as well. But these were proper sort of quote-unquote regular troops, Seleucid-wise. And they may have formed the first step in a gradual re-equipment of the same phalanx. That's why we said before, being 5,000 and seeing there that the Argyraspides had been degraded to 5,000 instead of the 10,000, you could make that equation that these Romanized infantrymen were just the former Argyraspides. Because it was also fine equipment overall, right? By the Battle of Beth-Zacharia in 162, the infantry as a whole is described from the Seleucid side as wearing male cuirasses and bronze helmets. They could have been principes, right? Though the presence of a single Roman-style unit at the head of the elephant divisions, according to the first Maccabees account, may have prompted the generalization. Those converted to Roman armament, it is very interesting because there is an interspersion of these troops between the elephants. You know, that some later Hellenistic rulers, look at Pyrrhus, he had interspersed the Italic mercenaries, allies, among his own phalangites because he was running out of their manpower throughout the Italian campaign. So that was actually also a Seleucid defeat that the Bible references to. But you understand how things were gradually changing. There was some kind of development. You can read the passage, but the point being that we're not entirely sure that the entirety of this Seleucid force at Beth-Zacharia was armed the Roman way, right? We can imagine that by this point the converted Romanized, say, Seleucid troops would have literally entailed the use of a scutum, of a gladius hispaniensis, even though they were all kind of this stuff, like there were simpler overshields like the tureoi, there were the xiphoe, other types of swords, but also pila. There you could have javelins, and heavy javelins kind of existed around, so we don't have to think about 100% copy of the Roman army, even though in that sense Antiochus would have liked to show off a little bit. We can think of, again, all kind of combinations. Maybe if the Argyraspides were really so inspired to the Macedonian style, they would have at least not lost the Attic, a crested Attic helmet, instead of wearing essentially a barbarian Roman or Celtic-looking equipment. We can imagine of different colors here and there, basic pinkish red uniforms, shield blazons, from some terracotta evidence for this Romanized troops, where the Chalkaspides may have borne a Macedonian shield displaying the diademed and radiate head of the same Antiochus IV, especially as this was a dedication to Apollo, so the springing forth of a new age, the ushering in as the new force under the same Antiochus with his army that he was the medium of God for. So we can imagine some regimental colors even. navy blue, crimson, saffron cloak, or something like that. So if you have really to be stereotypical about it. Further evidence for the appearance of Romanized Seleucid infantry derives from a Hellenistic terracotta figurine excavated at Nippur, the ancient Mesopotamian city in southern Babylonia, that remained an important center under Seleucid administration, continuing as a religious and scholarly hub, with a temple of Enlil that received royal patronage. We talked a bit about even the Mesopotamian battlefields and the importance that these deities had in actual clashes around the region. This was really one of the oldest and most enduring cult centers of Mesopotamia. In fact, it retained its religious importance under the Seleucids, who continued the tradition of royal benefactions to its temples while using the city as an administrative node in Babylonia. Well, this terracotta figurine of Nippur shows a shoulder guard consistent with a male cuirass beneath the right shoulder and a sword worn on the right side in the Roman manner, while an irregularity at the center of the shield may preserve the remains of a traditional Seleucid device, such as a Medusa Rondanini head upon a bed of scales. The Medusa Rondanini, by the way, is a famous classical Hellenic marble sculpture, not now in Munich, depicting the head of Medusa in a humanized, highly stylized way, originally mirroring the design placed on the shield of Athena Parthenos by the master sculptor Phidias. Now, the missing head of the Nippur figurine has been restored with a bronze helmet of the Ascalon type, suitable for a late Seleucid infantryman. A parallel reconstruction of a soldier of the Chalkaspides regiment at the time of Daphne parade employs a shield device taken from a coin of the Cilician city of Alexandria on Issus, founded, in fact, one of the many Alexandrias, founded near, in this case, the site of Alexander's victory of the most famous battle of Issus of 333, and an important mint under Antiochus IV as well. It functioned as a mint and administrative center in Cilicia. And this reconstruction, let's say, displays a Macedonian shield bearing in its center the head of the king adorned with the royal diadem and the sunburst crown, right, which is appropriate if we want to really elaborate on this imagery, as far as we were saying before, like this new age, the aura, the halo of the sun for Antiochus Epiphanes, right? It literally was counting on that manifestation, that epiphany. And this device would have probably been more that of the Chalkaspides than the Argyraspides, since a further terracotta shield from Eretria, the city on the island of Euboea, whose archaeological finds include numerous Hellenistic military representations, aside from being famous from the Persian wars, but also having been actually controlled and liberated from Macedonian control and being part of have a subsequent involvement in the Cremonidean War, but there is a lot of history here. But in any case, it's a rich series of terracottas reflecting the city's continued prosperity and artistic production in the Hellenistic period, show a silver Macedonian shield with a star in the center. And this makes us think that it actually could belong to the Argyraspides, as the only Hellenistic regiment known to have used silver shields. Right, I made a video about the Hellenistic shield blazons. If you're interested, they're all very Olympian symbology. It's all about stars, sun. This is obvious also for Macedon. It's very interesting that there's a star, in fact, here connected with what would be, in fact, perhaps probably an Argyraspides model. The remainder of the Chalkaspides armor could have included, I don't know, some further, again, similar color to the one we've seen for the Romanized infantry. I don't know, navy blue, crimson uniform that we find among the same Antigonid Chalkaspides regiment depicted in the tomb of Lyson and Callicles, a richly painted Macedonian tomb of the early 2nd century BC near Lefkadia that preserves detailed representations of military equipment dated to the early years of Philip V of Macedon and belonging to a family of officers who served under the Antigonid kings. All right, in a time in which, as you know, we're in the 2nd century BC, also the contact with the Romans, the general sort of modernization or innovation and the relevance of the phalanx was a thing, right? And the tomb, discovered near the modern Lefkada, contains wall paintings that provide the most detailed surviving colored representations of Macedonian military dress and equipment from the early 2nd century BC. I, by the way, inserted one of the panoplies in the thumbnail from this beautiful tomb, right? And we can imagine, in fact, that same kind of outfit, even for Seleucid troops. That's why I added it in the thumbnail. But you can imagine also, again, other varieties and combinations. The Ascalon type helmet, for example, that this, as you see here, these, like from this tomb, you have the clear idea. This is true also for the Middle Ages, that all ancient armor was fundamentally painted. Admittedly, not all of it, but much of it is like lacquered. And imagine a modern, I don't know, racing, sort of motorcycle racing helmet, right? They looked extraordinarily alike to that. And you can imagine, indeed, even these Hellenistic units having some regimental colors. I made some videos about how this would have worked, for example, for the Roman army. If you're interested, we'll get back on the topic. Because individual units that, as you've seen here, also brought their own local resources, would standardize. Like the state wouldn't normally standardize, if not for picked units, like in this case, also for Epiphanes' displays that were quite bombastic in many ways. Imagine, I don't know, a saffron, a yellow cloak as well. So these are also very expensive colors, right? You really have to, they're very pricey. You have to have status to wear them. So they're not all standardized per se, right? It was some level of personalization, customization. I mean, even today, even with full uniformity industrially wise, like soldiers go out there in very different ways sometimes. As we already hinted at here, helmet types associated with late Seleucid infantry include the Ascalon form, which may be compared with a bronze helmet found in Romania that resembles both Ascalon and Sida, two specimens. At some point, we'll enter in the depths of all these typologies. I still have to make a video about... I made one about the Hellenistic helmets in the Roman army, right? But not about Hellenistic helmets per se. And with a helmet manufactured on an early 1st century BC gem impression now in the Kestner Museum. We have to rush because I don't have all the time here. We have coins of the Roman Caecili Metelli family struck in 128 and 125, displaying Seleucid badges of an elephant's head and galley prow, possibly reflecting the embassy of 140 that may have imposed the terms of Apameia, the peace treaty of 188 that severely restricted Seleucid naval and military power west of the Taurus, forbade, because the Romans were there now, forbade the Seleucids from keeping war elephants, limited their fleet, and required the surrender of territory west of the Taurus together with a large indemnity. While later denarii of the same Caecili Metelli gens show a Macedonian shield bearing an elephant's head blazon that may have been carried by a Seleucid regiment. A lead weight from 108 and 7 BC from the territory of Marissa, the Idumaean city in southern Palestine, that retained a mixed Hellenistic population, and later Seleucid and early Asmonaean rule after its capture by John Hyrcanus, excavated extensively in the 20th century, yielding a rich assemblage of Hellenistic material reflecting this mixed Idumaean, Phoenician, and Hellenic population, bears a Macedonian shield whose significance is symbolic and anachronistic rather than an accurate representation of contemporary regimental equipment. Mercenary shields in Seleucid service more commonly carried the royal anchor, blazon, most famously enough. There was the legion, various versions of how that had come to be the most important. Depicted upside down to modern eyes on bronze coins of Seleucus II struck at Apameia, important military colony and arsenal on the Orontes founded by Seleucus I, is one of the 4 great cities of the Syrian Tetrapolis. By the way, it served as the principal military headquarters and elephant stables on the early Seleucid kings. So imagine that kind of heraldry, importantly enough. A brief mention here, I don't know if we have time really, but this is a system of recruitment that supplied the phalanx, resting upon legal status rather than simple exchange of land and service. We've seen how Although discharged servicemen received allotments of agricultural land as a gratuity for past service, and some authorities have assumed that ownership of a kleros entailed hereditary military obligation, no direct evidence connects these two phenomena within the Seleucid Empire. Settlements of Jewish ex-mercenaries planted by Antiochus III in Phrygia and Lydia, regions of West Central Asia Minor, where the king settled military colonists after his recovery of those territories from Attalid control, following the defeat of Achaeus and the reassertion of Seleucid authority west of the Taurus, as we've seen before the Treaty of Apamea. Well, these Jewish military settlers transferred from Babylonia and Mesopotamia around 200 BC were intended to secure the newly recovered territories against both internal unrest and external threats from the Attalids and Galatians. It was full of Jewish auxiliaries in the Levant, as a matter of fact, made pretty good medium kind of troops, but they were auxiliaries, right? They were not part of the system. But they, for example, never appear in battle lists and therefore seem to have never been even mobilized at a point. And so they were much more ad hoc, fielded in different ways. So, as we were saying before, the term Macedonian, when we look at these phalangites, formed as this privileged legal category protected by the state, essentially, the monarchy, whose holders were liable to conscription for training and subsequent mobilization, but they would just use their own status in order to aggrandize themselves further through their feats of arms. A fragment of Pezhetairos of Ephesus records that Temison the Cyprian, a favorite of Antiochus II, was announced at festivals as Temison the Macedonian, even though he was not Macedonian, and an announcement explicable only by his enrollment in a Macedonian corps. We know his origin was not Macedonian, so you see. And it made an entire video explaining how these colonies fundamentally worked. Parallel developments in Ptolemaic Egypt suggest the overwhelming majority of military colonists descended indeed from the original soldiers of the first ruler, however, with few new settlers added in later reigns. And a comparable proportion of Seleucid Macedonians may likewise have been military colonists without any institutional identity between the two categories. The question of body armor for the ordinary phalangite we discussed before remains debated. The military code of Amphipolis, the Macedonian city whose early 3rd century regulations governing garrison service survive in an inscription from the reign of Antigonus Gonatas, the code inscribed in stone regulating the duties, equipment, and discipline of a Macedonian garrison and providing rare documentary evidence for practical administration of Hellenistic military units, imposes fines for failure to carry various items, but mentions breastplates only for officers, a circumstance that has been taken to indicate that the phalangites of Philip and Alexander, and by extension those of Philip V later, because we're talking Europe, lacked breastplates. Because essentially in the West there would have been less missile. This is nonsense, right? It's also, Amphipolis' code is famous, it's unique in its kind, because you can make comparisons with the Romans that were much brutally disciplined and, killed people for sleeping on the watch or whatever. Apparently here the Hellenes look a bit weaker, and so there is this, for example, Secunda makes this claim, this idea that the relative scarcity of missile troops in the European theater would have made these troops less armored, right? But so limited financial resources may have made the additional weight unnecessary everywhere. The fact that the Seleucid East, seeing more in the 3rd century of Eastern foes, doesn't make much sense. I mean, yes, you have Cretans, Persians, but the Thracians as well. I mean, why not the Balkans should have not had that, right? The idea that Oriental missile troops would just hit the Seleucids and that you need just, again, to have heavier armor in the East, that doesn't make much sense. But chainmail armor was surely impulsively added also because of these reasons by the first ranks of the phalanx. So we do not know the proportion, but claiming again that simply the reduction of the shield size, which was a thing since the beginning of the Macedonian forces, would require simply more armor. It's not there. We were not really acquainted with that. It's, again, heavy infantry because of what it does as a formation, not for other reasons. The only direct literary evidence for phalanx troops using breastplates comes from Philopoemen's Achaean army, yet the same conclusion applies with greater force to the Seleucids, who face predominantly lighter forces east of the Tigris, at least according to Secunda. The description in Maccabees, one of the Seleucid infantry at Beth-Zacharia, as equipped with chainmail is best understood, at least for the entirety of the infantry, as an exaggeration prompted by the sight of the single Roman-style contingent that headed the elephant divisions, if we have to interpret it that way. since the emphatic statement that the Roman contingent at Daphne wore chainmail, implying that any body armor possessed by other phalanx units was of a different style of some sort as well. And it does make sense somehow. Ornamented shields of bronze and gold, although tested earlier among the Thebans of Epaminondas. I made a video about the Battle of Lectros. This was the most famous 4th century BC Boeotian general who reformed Theban tactics and defeated the Spartans at Leuctra in 371 BC by concentrating force on one wing. His tactical innovations at this battle in Mantinea permanently altered Hellenic infantry practice by emphasizing deep and oblique attack. In the troops of Eumenes of Cardia, the secretary of Alexander recommended the silver shields, the Argyraspides, during the wars of the successors, demonstrating both the fighting quality and the political unreliability of Alexander's veteran infantry are absent from the detailed accounts of Antiochus III's campaigns and may have been introduced only by Antiochus Epiphanes in keeping with his taste for luxury and splendor. Right? The practice of polishing shields before battle for both maintenance and psychological effect was nevertheless common throughout the entire Hellenistic world. The Greeks in general cared very much about their shields. They called their units on the basis of that. Speaking of organic, for explaining a little bit like how the phalangites worked here, we know very few subdivisions of the Seleucid phalanx specifically. Right, the Antigonid and Ptolemaic systems divided the phalanx into strategiae of 4,000 men, each containing 4 chiliarchies of 1,000, each chiliarchy 4 speirai of 256, each speira 4 tetrarchies of 64, and each tetrarchy 4 files of 16, the file being the fundamental unit of coordination. The strategia itself is never named as a tactical unit in Seleucid sources, yet some Seleucid strategoi customary regarded as provincial governors or independent commanders may in fact have led strategiae. Smaller units appear as stagmata whose secretaries kept registers of soldiers at Magnesia, the crushing battle of 190 or late 190, early 189 on the plain of the Hermus, in which the Roman and Pergamene forces, as we were talking about before, under Lucius Cornelius Scipio, and actually his brother, he would become Asiaticus because of this victory, but his brother was famously there. If you're interested in what happened afterward because of the connection also with Antiochus before the battle, look at the trial in the Scipiones if you're not aware of that. Defeated, in fact, the Seleucid king after his failed invasion of Hellas, where the Romans had crushed him at Thermopylae. It ended Antiochus' attempt to expand into Europe and led directly to the Treaty of Apameia, demonstrating the superiority of the Manipular legion over the Hellenistic phalanx when the latter's flanks were turned, at least, and there were other forces there were quite crucial. There you have actually Cataphrax smashing frontally a Roman heavy infantry unit, which tells you how powerful actually even that unit was. Very balanced clash. So the neat superiority of Manipular legion is not quite there. Like it's a draw, basically, if you look at these battles, but still the Romans succeeded. So there is that pinch that made them superior over this enormous system of Alexander's, like Philip II's and Alexander III's legacy. We know some Semaii forming the Peltas Argyraspides, where Antiochus III engaged the Bactrians, interestingly enough. The constant numerical strength of the Argyraspides at approximately 10,000 reduced at Daphne to 5,000 once the Roman contingent is subtracted suggests either a limited term of service that allowed continuous recruitment of new young settlers or the regular replacement of those who inherited land, proving incompetent or causing trouble, so that discharged guardsmen rejoined the reserve phalanx, as we've seen before. And this continuous sort of re-extraction system was much more of a rigid hierarchy and form of levy, if not more impositively for the rank-and-file pezhetairos. The same principle of selection from the strongest and most physically capable youths of each region is already visible in Theopompus' description of the pezhetairos who served as foot guard under Philip II, the Macedonian king, obviously, who created the professional phalanx itself in the mid-4th century BC by reforming the traditional infantry, introducing the sarissa after observing sort of the necessity of some more combined armed tactics during his Illyrian Thracian wars, but also receiving significant input, even though it's a completely different tactic from the one of the Hellenes, right? But still having to do with the development, at least the infantry side. Philip's military reforms in the 50s and 40s of the 4th century transformed the Macedonian infantry from a relatively lightly kept force into the professional sarissa armed phalanx that became the model for later Hellenistic armies, together with their formidable, crushing, and truly feudal, the only exception in sedentary Europe, cavalry. All right. And it's we find also in Anaximenes' attribution of the core of the strongest, the fittest, to an earlier Alexander, perhaps the second, indicating that the Seleucid system continued as an established Macedonian practice rather than inventing an entirely new one. Because we don't know whether, in fact, the whole army had ever been reformed, right? We don't really see this. We understand that certain parts of the phalanx became sort of more permanently there. The fact that the Argyraspides as an elite crack force were so many for such a long time, as a matter of fact, may have brought to some of that idea. The Leucaspides are not present in the Seleucid army. If you look at the Antigonids, it's something similar. So they experimented with this stuff, but we don't have any clear reform, right, in the Seleucid army compared to Alexander's time, even though changes would have happened, as we just explained. The Pompus of Chios and Anaximenes of Lampsacus, by the way, are both contemporaries of Philip, providing the earliest literary testimony of the organization and selection of these troops. So the video is incredibly long, and I actually wanted to make it shorter, but I think we looked at many different things that are very useful to frame who these phalanges were. If you're curious about this, you can read Bar Kochba's work on the Seleucid army. That is by far the best, essentially. There are lots of articles if you can find information from online, but that's great work. You have Secunda, that is very much attentive also to reconstructionism, to the there's the World Montbert series that talks about the stuff of the various before we've seen the terracotta figurines. If you want to know, at least this is relatively dated, but where you can find the iconographic sources for this, if you're interested in it. Sometimes they're very difficult to find because, admittedly, sometimes there aren't even pictures online of this stuff. And so sometimes you have to check, to double, triple check all these sources, whatever. But there is really lots of scholarship on this, and this is more or less the idea of the Seleucid phalangite as the standard guy, right? In the AI picture, perhaps the shields are a bit too big. Sometimes there are some pretty small ones at some point in some picture. But there was variation. We'll never fully know how it really worked. In any case, this is in a relatively simplified manner what you find also in the scholarship. And buy books, because books are important. You are this is not an easy moment for any kind of publication, but they're going to be the gold of the future, unless, of course, like AI will probably treasure this stuff, and you can find this information autonomously. But all the various explanations, all the various etymologies of how the system worked, I think they fit this military historical unit series, right? Because they give a historical dimension to these figures, right? Regarding the Seleucids, I actually made very few videos. I think like 3 or 4, whatever. Here we are. Seleucid history. It's all about warfare. The Battle of Azotus, 148 BC. Very early videos. Seleucid cavalry philoi, hippeis, politikoi, and epilectoi. Seleucid cataphracts, Syrians, Mesopotamians, and Persians in the Seleucid army. The latter is somehow an important video, and there is really much more to do, but I'm glad that I added this video. Will make increasingly better content. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.